Magnus Carlsen is playing the best chess of his life, executing mind-blowing moves that no carbon-based life form has any business finding, and destroying the world's most elite players in the process. But for him, this is just business as usual. Perfect case in point is this 2900 rated master, which Magnus recently took down in a 3-minute blitz game with a move so filthy and so unbelievable that it rendered me utterly speechless. Which can be a problem when you're a chess commentator. I did eventually regain sufficient composure to make this video, however, and so here we are, at the beginning where Magnus has the white pieces and opens the game with e4. And from black, who only goes by the username Snowflake, if anyone knows who this is, please let me know, we have a Caro-Kann defense on the board with c6 supporting d5, whose main line Magnus has no interest in traversing. d4 is of course the most popular move, but he instead goes for the less common knight to f3. And after d5 from black, goes for the rather vapid d3. Again, not the most popular move, but Magnus is doing his Magnus-y thing here, tearing away his opponent's security blanket in the form of any opening preparation he might have. Knight to c3 was the main line, and more principled in my opinion, I wouldn't want to allow d takes e4, followed by the trade of queens so early in the game, especially if I had the white pieces. But then again, I'm not one of the greatest endgame technicians to ever walk the face of the earth. But we don't get the pawn or the queen trade. Black plays g6, just going all out for the win against Magnus. Gotta respect that. He wants a story to tell the grandchildren. Magnus plays knight b to d2, which at this point is a bit better than knight to c3, since that would allow black the space gaining d4 with tempo on the knight. This move d4 is becoming a little more attractive for black compared to a move ago, since it can be quickly supported with bishop to g7. Black fianchettos. Magnus prepares to do the same with g3. Bishop to e2 is playable as well, but Magnus prefers to take aim at the center. We get e5 now from black, getting that fantasy pawn center that we all dream about, but blocking the bishop's diagonal. But in this case, it's totally worth it. Magnus continues bishop to g2. We have knight to e7 preparing the castle. Knight to f6 would of course block the bishop's defense of the pawn on e5, losing it to knight takes e5. Both players castle, and now rook to e1 for Magnus, threatening to win the e-pawn with e takes d5, followed by knight takes e5. Knight to d7 adds defense, which brings us to a good moment to stop and assess. Black clearly has superior central pawns, still placed ideally, but white's knight on f3 is superior to its counterpart on e7, exerting pressure on e5, which the knight on d7 is tied down to defending. And the next big question for Magnus is how to develop the dark squared bishop. Knight to b3 is playable, opening the diagonal, but if black chooses to play d4 and c5, setting up that nice pawn wedge, Magnus might rather play the knight to c4, where it's eyeing d6. So he wants to keep that move in reserve. Another option is b3, opening the diagonal for the bishop this way. But this move also makes d4 a bit more desirable for black, since b3 removes protection from the c3 square, which makes it harder for white to put a pawn there. This is of course his best method for challenging that central pawn wedge. So what do you do when your opponent's intentions are not yet clear and you want to maintain flexibility? Well, you play a move that you know is going to be good no matter what, and the move Magnus chooses is a4. The engine had a slight preference for b4, with the plan of developing the knight to b3 behind the pawn. This of course addresses black's potential pawn wedge with the threat of taking on c5, but a4 is also quite good, threatening to seize more space with a5. Hence the response a5 from black, halting the expansion at the cost of removing some support from the b5 square, so that after b3 from Magnus, if black were to now play d4 and c5, then c4 becomes an even more attractive post for the knight than before, since it can never be kicked away with the move b5, since white's a pawn can simply capture the b pawn, and it cannot be replaced with another pawn. So black says no to the move d4. He wants to keep control of c4 and instead goes for rook to e8. But the engine is not a fan of this move, saying that Magnus should continue bishop to b2 to pressure e5 with ideas of d4, when black's best response will be to close the door on the bishop with the move d4, allowing that knight to c4 move, which if attacked with b5 will land on d6 with a fork of the rook and the pawn on b5, which will be won on the next move. So this variation demonstrates why the engine doesn't really like this move rook to e8, as it has the potential to give white that move knight to d6 with tempo. But Magnus didn't go for bishop to b2, he played h4, which is a very Magnus-y thing to do, and normally a very engine-y thing to do as well, though not here. Magnus is obviously thinking about h5 in the near future, and for the moment, black can get away with removing some of the defense of e5 with the move knight to f6, which he really ought to play before white increases the pressure on that square with bishop to b2. That way, he can jump to g4, defending the pawn again from a more active square, while maintaining his ideal pawn formation. But instead, black goes for the significantly inferior d takes e4, which raises an interesting question. How should white recapture the pawn? Pause the video if you'd like to try to determine which option is best and why. The move played by Magnus is knight takes e4. D takes e4 is actually decent as well, and maybe just as good as knight takes e4, since it maintains a pawn on that central e4 square, but this does block the light squared bishop's diagonal, and gives black a chance to play b5, stopping knight to c4. So white can continue bishop b2 with some pressure on e5, and is somewhat better, but Magnus's move knight takes e4 comes with the immediate threat of knight to d6. You don't really want the knight to settle into a square like that, where it can be further supported by bishop to a3. So it's really necessary to cover that square with the move knight to f5, played now by black, which unfortunately blocks the move f5, which means that the knight on e4 isn't getting kicked off its central post anytime soon. Now some of you might ask, why not play g4 here, driving that f5 knight back from whence it came? And others of you might say because it loses a pawn to knight takes h4. But still others among you will recognize that after knight takes h4 and queen takes h4, bishop g5 is going to trap that black queen, which is why knight to e7 would actually be best, allowing knight to d6, but then black will get some compensation with the move knight to d5, targeting that hole on f4. So in this position, the engine's favorite move is actually h5, threatening g4, then h6, so black should really capture the h-pawn, to which white responds knight to h2, targeting black's weakened king side with the queen. It's not winning or anything, but it looks promising. Magnus played none of these moves, however. He went with bishop to g5, which is decent. He's trying to provoke black into playing f6, which would further block his dark squared bishop's diagonal, while opening a diagonal to the king. But this is actually black's best option, gaining a tempo by attacking that bishop on g5. But in the game, we instead have queen to c7, which makes h5 even more juicy for white than it was a move earlier. And without getting bogged down in too many complex variations, I'm just going to say that the reason for this seems to be based on the fact that the black queen no longer has a defensive view of the king side as it did on d8. It's not doing anything very active on c7. White's bishop is more aggressively placed, and black will have to make some weakening move if he wants to kick it from that square. Again, if g takes h5, we'll have knight to h2, getting the queen involved. Is white winning here? I don't even know, but black has good reason to be nervous. But the move played now by Magnus, g4, allows black to pretty much equalize the position with knight to e7. So why isn't this so great for white? Well, first of all, if white were to play h5 now and black captures, you don't have the idea of getting the queen to h5 since the g-pawn is blocking that diagonal. Furthermore, the g-pawn is pretty weak and will be targeted with this bishop as soon as this d7 knight moves somewhere. So it's not really good to let that pawn sit on g4 for too long. It would have been better to let the black knight hang out on f5 until the time is right, and then get in g4 with g5 on the very next move. At least that's the engine's vision for how the attack should go, and I'm not one to argue with it. But Magnus has a completely different vision for this position with his move d4. And even though this isn't the top engine move, it's still calling for h5. I love this move d4 anyway, because it's just so trappy. The threat is to take on e5 a couple times, and then land a knight on f6. And black has some decent responses here, like h6, f5, or even f6. But you know what's not included in black's list of good responses? E takes d4, the move played in the game, falling right into Magnus's little trap. And the fact that he finds these kinds of little tricks in a blitz game really blows my mind. And his response here isn't even the most amazing move of the game. That comes a bit later. But see if you can find white's best move here. And good luck. It's not obvious. But here it comes. Magnus Carlsen's brilliant response is queen to d2. Just going after the dark squares. And you might think bishop to h6 is the plan. But it's not. Bishop to f4 is where it's at. Attacking the black queen, threatening knight to d6. Now, there are things black can do. Well, the engine's giving two moves that don't lose anyway. One of them is d3, with the discovered attack on the rook, which Magnus must have seen, after which you gotta wonder if he would have found the only move to maintain his advantage, which is c4, sacrificing that exchange in order to keep a knight out of d5, which will leave black with the dark squared holes around his king, no longer defended by a bishop. So that variation favors white. The other move to keep black in the game is the one that was played, knight to d5. Okay, you're preventing bishop to f4, but white can keep his initiative going by playing knight takes d4, followed by c4, just attacking that knight, when black's best chance is going to be to counterattack with h6, and white is much better here as well, but Magnus instead tries h5, which is not so great anymore. He's a little late to the party with that move. Black has a strong response, knight to e5, removing defense from f6, but the d5 knight still has that covered. If white were to play knight to f6 check, you of course want to capture there with the knight as opposed to the bishop. So it was better for Magnus to work on kicking that knight off of d5 as soon as possible. But okay, the position is again about equal. Magnus takes on e5, and here's something remarkable happens. Black needs to play rook takes e5, but instead commits a terrible blunder with bishop takes e5, giving Magnus a forced win, which incredibly he misses. Magnus could have ended the game with knight to f6 check, but somehow the existence and or ramifications of this pin on black's bishop to the rook on e8 escaped his engine-like mind, which is not immune to an occasional glitch. The point is that this is a fork of the king and rook, the knight's gotta be removed, and you can only capture with a knight. But after bishop takes f6, what are you doing about queen to h6 and checkmate on g7? The bishop is pinned, and if black tries something like queen to d6, attacking the bishop, white can even win by just trading everything on e5, like so, and then hitting the queen with rook to e1. And you can see where this is going. After the queen moves, the rook gets to the 8th rank with check, drives the king to g7, and then there's h6 check, driving the king out into the open, where he will get mated like so. So that would have been an easy win for Magnus, but it is a blitz game, and these things occasionally do get missed, even by the world's #1. And Magnus will totally redeem himself from this oversight with the move we have coming up. So getting back to the game, where Magnus misses his easy win with knight to f6, he instead opts for f4, attacking the bishop on e5. Now if black were to take on f4, he'll still run into the same tactical issues involving knight to f6 check, so the bishop must retreat. Toward the king side, of course, keeping an eye on these most critical weakened dark squares, h8 is the best place for the bishop, since on g7, it would have just been driven back with the move h6, creating needless and fatal back rank mating ideas for white. And at this point, Magnus is probably looking at this position and salivating over knight to f6. Kind of like the way you look at a donut that you really want, but realize it's not going to be good for you. Or in this case, he's not going to have anything better than a draw after knight takes f6, defending the rook, and if bishop takes f6, black can just play bishop takes g4, and white has nothing. So Magnus peers deeply into this position, hones in on exactly what he wants, envisions his dream scenario, and decides he's going to seize that dream at any cost. And so in this position, he uncorks a move that doesn't force the win, yet it's so tricky and so sinister that it might just be my favorite move of the year so far. I don't know. To spot this in a blitz game is just unreal. So take a moment, Take an hour. See if you can guess what Magnus played in this position. It's a move that Stockfish doesn't like at first, but practically speaking, I think it's the best way for white to play for a win. And that move is c4, simply attacking the knight, which of course needs to keep defending f6 to guard against knight to f6 check. With that discovery, unless you play the move Stockfish suggests, which isn't the move played in the game, but I'll show you that briefly. That move is knight to e3, which works because it blocks the file. Here white needs to play bishop to f6, threatening queen takes d4, and then there's this crazy engine line where black sacks the exchange in order to get his queen active with queen takes f4, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this line, but long story short, after initially thinking this favors black, Stockfish, at a deeper search depth, changes its mind and decides that there's nothing better than a perpetual check, like so. And this variation demonstrates why Magnus Carlsen's move was not winning, but black did not go for this drawing line with knight to e3, because why go into that convoluted mess when you can simply grab on c3? En passant, winning a pawn with an attack on the queen. f6 is still covered, and it looks like black is just winning. So here's another quiz position for you. What do you think Magnus does next? He has but one move that doesn't lose, and that move is the stunning queen takes d5, a beautiful sacrifice which cannot be accepted. For if c takes d5 were to be played, there would follow a mate in 3 with knight to f6 check, and now if king to g7, then h6 will force the king back to the 8th rank, where rook takes e8 will mate on the next move, and if bishop takes f6, there follows rook takes e8 check, king to g7, and h6 checkmate. Very nice, using only a rook and a pawn. But this isn't how the game ended. Magnus Carlsen's 2900 rated opponent saw what was coming if he were to accept that sacrificed queen and instead played bishop takes g4. The best move, which actually should still draw the game, despite black being a piece down, since he does now have 3 extra pawns. But he will have to play very accurately, since his king is far from safe. So here, knight to f6 is not working for white, since the rooks are connected. So Magnus does need to move his queen to safety. The engine says that queen to c4 is best, planning knight to c5 next, but Magnus goes for queen to c5, which is only slightly inferior, if at all. Either way, black can get a draw, but he has to continue with the correct move. And there is only one. That is rook to e6. It's absolutely essential to provide extra coverage for f6, so the knight can't go there. But instead, black goes for the blunderous rook a to d8, thinking that after knight to f6 check, now played by Magnus, he can trade bishop for knight with bishop takes f6, like so, and everything will be just fine. But everything is pretty far from fine. The black rook is hit, it goes to c8, but now comes queen to g5, threatening to go to h6 with mate on g7, also attacking the bishop on g4 in the process. So what can black do? Well, you can counterattack the bishop on f6 with queen to d6, but now Magnus grabs the pawn on c3. Black now only has 2 pawns for the piece, which is why bishop takes h5 is now the best move, though still totally losing. Queen to h6 isn't a threat at the moment due to the threat of queen to c5 check, which would pick up the bishop, but white can just play something like king to h2 with a winning position. Black's extra pawns provide not nearly enough compensation for white's bishop duo, and the ever-present threats to black's horribly weakened kingside, where white's queen and bishop dominate those dark squares. But in the game, for whatever reason, black decided not to grab on h5, and instead played bishop to f5. And after queen to f6 from Magnus, threatening checkmate, and so forcing a trade of queens, black resigned, seeing that he would only have the 2 extra pawns against the bishop duo in a hopeless endgame. For example, after queen takes f6, bishop takes f6, if you were to grab on h5 with g takes h5, then there's bishop to f3. The h-pawn is getting rounded up. If bishop to c2, counterattacking on b3, white can just take on h5 and just allow bishop takes b3 because here comes rook takes e8 check, followed by rook to b1, hitting the bishop. And if bishop takes a4, there's rook takes b7, now going after f7 with mating threats already in the air, to which there is no good defense. For example, if rook to f8, then there's bishop to e7, hitting the rook. If you attack the bishop with rook to e8, then it just goes to g5, and if rook back to f8 to defend, here comes bishop to h6, and Stockfish is actually giving a mate in 7 in this position. The bishop duo just dominates this endgame. Black's resignation was not early at all. So what a fantastic lesson in how to create fiendishly hard problems for your opponent to solve by playing moves that in this case were not always objectively perfect, but which nevertheless made life so difficult for this 2900 rated master and gave him such a narrow path to that elusive draw that he became completely overwhelmed. Magnus's ability to pinpoint all of his opponent's weaknesses in a given position and then find brilliant and unexpected ways to exploit them is truly staggering. I mean, to revisit this position where Magnus plays c4, he had to already have seen the queen sacrifice, or else d takes c3 would just be losing. And then after knight to f6 check and the winning of the rook on e8, he had to see that the h-pawn would be the one to deliver mate. So truly incredible board vision from Magnus Carlsen, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed this and want to see more like it in the near future, and I will see you soon.